Dad, could you maybe not stand in the shots? Guests might think you're part of the help, Ashley said, her voice sharp as a razor, cutting clean through the laughter and the hum of the wedding preparations in Frank's own backyard. The groom's mother gave a thin smile, tilting her mimosa. Well, at least he's handy with the heavy lifting. Frank said nothing. The anger rose in him like a slow, steady tide, but he held it back. Instead of arguing, he picked up the wedding envelope he had prepared his gift and slid it into the clear acrylic box. The sound of tape sealing the lid was dry, deliberate, final. It echoed like the closing of a door. He turned to leave without another word. "Hey, Dad," Ashley called after him, her tone almost playful but edged with entitlement. "Where's our gift?" Frank paused mid-step but didn't look back. His voice was low, gravelly, and calm. "You'll get your gift," he said, at the right time. His silence carried more weight than anger ever could. It wasn't surrender, it was a promise. Over 99% of viewers just sat through this story without clicking like or subscribe. Actually, it's easy, just one tap. What time is it in your area, and where are you listening? Frank knew this smell by heart. It was the scent of damp earth after a night of dew, the sharp tongue of freshly cut grass, and the faint pine resin drifting from his workshop. It was the smell of beginnings of promise in the air. 60 years of living had taught him that the best things in life usually started with calloused hands and a coil of heavy wire slung over one shoulder. He stood on the aluminum ladder, threading a string of lights through the white beams of the wedding tent, twisting each small pearl-like bulb into place with the patient precision of habit. When the warm amber glow came alive and melted away the chill of dawn, and the backyard where his daughter, Ashley, had once learned to ride a bike, transformed into something grand, almost holy. Frank smiled, the quiet smile of a craftsman proud of his work. The peace didn't last long. As the sun climbed higher, trucks began to roll in, their engines rumbling through the still morning air. Men in black uniforms carried crates and flowers, while a woman with a perfect bun and a headset looking more like a Secret Service agent than a wedding planner strode toward him. Her name was Corinne. Her eye swept over Frank's work clothes, lingered a moment on his dusty boots, and then she pointed briskly toward the back. "Staff prep areas behind the tent, near the shed," she said, her tone clipped and efficient. Frank nodded, not bothering to explain that the shed had been built by his own hands 20 years ago. Today, he was just part of the scenery. Soon, the world around him filled with details from a life that no longer felt like his. Rows of gold, Chiavari chairs lined up perfectly. A transparent acrylic seating chart gleamed with names etched in gold leaf. From one corner, a string quartet began tuning, their instruments singing the first sterile, elegant notes of canon in D. Eleanor, the groom's mother, was already there, dressed in tweed that looked far too heavy for the warming morning, holding a mimosa in her manicured hand. The bubbles rose in neat little streams. She smiled a smile that was just a little too bright, chatting with early guests. Her gaze brushed over Frank, who was now carrying a heavy ice chest toward the champagne tower. There was no recognition in her eyes, only classification. Then Ashley appeared, his daughter, radiant, ethereal, like she had stepped out of a magazine spread. The white satin of her dress shimmered beneath the very lights Frank had strung that morning. She stood beside her groom, Kevin, while the photographer fired off shot after shot, preparing for their first look. Frank, still holding the melting ice, accidentally stepped into the edge of the frame. The clicking stopped. "Dad," Ashley said. Her voice carried no warmth, just a hard spark of flint on stone. "Could you not stand in the shots? Guests might think you're the help." The air thickened. Pachobo's music went on, but now it sounded like mockery. Frank froze where he was. Water from the ice chest dripped onto his boots. Eleanor took a sip of her drink and said to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "He's handy, isn't he? Perfect for the heavy lifting." "I'm a Isurin." Corinne jumped in, professional and merciless. "Sir," she said, holding her clipboard like a shield, "staff staging is behind the tent." Ashley didn't even look at him. She shoved a bouquet of hydrangeas into his hands. "Hold this for me. And please don't stay too close, I don't want the first look shots ruined." Then, as if remembering something trivial, she added, her tone flat as a cashier's voice. Oh, and where's my gift? The envelope? Whatever warmth the morning had held was gone. In this place, a clean, cutting code spread through him a crack across the surface of his pride. Frank said nothing. Losing his temper would only make him look exactly like what they thought he was, a rough, unrefined old man. The workshop had taught him restraint. He set down the ice chest, went inside, and came back with a thick, white envelope. Inside, it was his daughter's future, wrapped and sealed. He walked to the acrylic gift box with its shiny gold lock. Before dropping the envelope in, he paused, glancing up at the small blue light blinking on the ring camera, recording. Good. Holding the envelope upright so the names Ashley and Kevin face the lens, he slid it through the narrow slot. Then, from his pocket, he took out a roll of clear packing tape. He tore off a long strip and sealed the slit shut. The tape made a sharp, dry hiss like a trigger being pulled. Without a word, Frank turned and walked toward his garage. His kingdom, the air was thick with the scents of wood, oil, and metal. His hand brushed the main breaker panel. One flick, and all that light, music, and luxury outside would go dark. Every contract, every insurance form, his name was on them. Through the small window, he could see Ashley laughing for the photographer, radiant and oblivious. The man she had just called the help stood watching from the shadows. His silence was not surrender. It was his opening move. Frank left the garage not as a homeowner, but as a ghost at his own celebration. The backyard was unrecognizable now. The late morning sun poured down in that golden light photographers call the magic hour. A white rose walkway stretched toward the altar. In one corner, a neon sign reading the Vances flickered pink above a photo booth. On a linen draped table nearby sat the clear acrylic gift box he had just sealed, beside a small, gold-embossed sign that said gifts. Everything was staged for perfection, and Frank was beginning to understand his role in the production. He wandered toward the tent's entrance, where another acrylic sign rested on an easel. The engraving was delicate, elegant, with deepest gratitude. He squinted to read the list below. Eleanor and Robert Vance, parents of the groom. Then Corinne Atwater, wedding planner. Then the florist, the quartet, even the tent rental company. He read it again slowly this time. His own name, Frank Miller, the man who had paid for most of the names on that board, the man who owned the ground beneath their feet, was nowhere to be found. It wasn't a punch, it was a splinter. Small, sharp, deliberate. A quiet erasure. He didn't feel anger, only a strange, icy clarity. He took out his phone. With emotions so small it was almost invisible, he snapped a photo of the sign. The shutter was silent, but in Frank's mind, it sounded like a judge's gavel. The first piece of evidence had been collected. Dad? Ashley's voice pulled him back. She stood with Kevin and his parents, surrounded by photographers and a videographer. They were posing for the family portraits. Ashley's smile was dazzling, though her eyes were not. She waved him over. For a brief second, hope flickered in Frank's chest. Maybe she had noticed his absence, but when he stepped closer, Ashley lowered her voice, a quick, urgent whisper meant for him alone. Dad, the envelope. They want to film us opening our gift for the video. Ah, of course. Not recognition. A prop. His gift wasn't a gesture of love, it was content. Before he could reply, Corinne glided in like a shark in a pencil skirt. Only immediate family for this segment, sir, she said, her tone impeccably polite and perfectly ruthless. One manicured hand touched the small of his back, just enough pressure to steer him out of the camera's perfect light. We need a clean frame. As ever, family, the word hung in the air, absurd and cruel. Right here, in his own backyard on the land he had built with his hands, Frank Miller was being written out of his own family portrait. He stepped back, blending into a small circle of guests near a cocktail table. Then came a laugh too light, too knowing. Jessica, one of Ashley's bridesmaids, holding a glass of champagne, leaned toward her friend and said loudly enough for everyone, including Frank, to hear. Well, as long as he's good at writing checks, right? The joke dropped like a stone. No one laughed. Jessica's friend managed a stiff, nervous smile. Another guest suddenly became fascinated by the bubbles in his drink. The silence that followed was heavy, social, suffocating, worse than any direct insult. It was the silence of polite complicity. We heard, we understood, and we choose not to intervene. That silence confirmed Frank's new role. He was not the father, he was the financier. And in that awful stillness, something inside him shifted. The crack of humiliation didn't vanish, it froze over. Hurt gave way to focus. He was no longer a participant seeking recognition. He had become an observer, a collector. He looked toward his daughter. Ashley was still smiling brightly for the camera, oblivious to the quiet collapse happening only a few feet away. She was waiting for her prop, the envelope. She didn't know her father had just captured proof of his invisibility, or that he had already recorded the judgment in that silence. Frank's gaze drifted to the sealed acrylic box. The envelope still rested inside. His daughter wanted it for the video. He hadn't given it yet. And now, standing outside the so-called family frame, he wasn't sure he ever would. His silence was no longer submission. It was strategy. As night settled in, the lights Frank had strung that morning finally earned their keep. They cast a honey gold glow that made everything and everyone look a little softer, a little kinder than real life. Silverware chimed against china, laughter rose and fell, and a mellow thread of jazz stitched it all together into a symphony of success. Frank sat at a table near the edge of the tent and watched in silence. This was the kingdom of applause, and he stood outside its border. The MC, his smile as polished as his shoes, stepped up to the mic. And now, let's hear a few words from our groom, Mr. Kevin Wentz. Applause swelled. Kevin rose, handsome in his tux, a microphone in one hand and a drink in the other. Frank recognized that drink, the deep amber in the glass, was from the bottle of Macallan 18 he'd given him at the rehearsal dinner, a small, welcoming gesture. Kevin had thanked him in passing, already scanning the room for someone more important. Thank you all for being here, Kevin began, warm and sure of himself. Today is the best day of my life. I marry the woman of my dreams. He smiled toward Ashley, who gazed back adoringly. After a few canned thanks to his own parents, he lifted his glass a little higher. And I want to toast, he said, voice ringing a notch louder. The men who built it all on their own. The one who started with nothing and made something. Self-made. The tent erupted in applause. Frank stared at the whiskey in his son-in-law's hand, a gift from the father-in-law who apparently didn't exist in the story of rugged independence. The slap didn't make a sound, but it stung worse than a punch. It hid behind a bright smile and the crowd's approval, a beautifully choreographed knife in the back. At the next table, one of Kevin's co-workers clapped a buddy on the shoulder and said, just loud enough for Frank to hear, "Guy runs a tight ship. No room for sentiment. No room for sentiment." Frank turned the words over. So family, a father's sacrifices, that was sentiment now. When Kevin wrapped up and the MC returned to center stage, Frank straightened automatically. According to the schedule, Corinne had emailed the one that never once listed him as host. The father of the bride was up next. He'd prepared a few lines, nothing fancy, just honest blessing. The MC beamed. What a terrific speech. And now, our best man, Mark. Frank blinked. Maybe a mix-up. He waited. After the best man came the maid of honor. Then the MC again. And that concludes tonight's formal remarks. Let's raise a glass to the happy couple. That was that. He'd been caught not by accident, but by design. Ashley must have caught the flicker of confusion on his face. Or maybe she was simply maintaining her brand. As Frank stood to fetch another glass of water, she intercepted him near the head table. Dad, she murmured, smile pinned in place for the nearby guests while her voice came cold. Try not to hover near the main table. It looks odd. Frank studied his daughter, the same girl he'd taught to ride a bike on this lawn. He didn't feel anger, only a widening distance he couldn't measure. He nodded. All right, honey. He offered the room a polite smile and stepped back. He didn't return to his seat. He slipped to the tent's edge and drew in the cool night air. The decision came clean and quick. The envelope would not be opened tonight. The gift would remain in the sealed box. He would not hand over the prop they needed for the final scene of their production. A small act of refusal, but it was his. Across the street, Mrs. Gable, an elderly neighbor, watched from her living room window. She couldn't hear the music or the speeches, only saw the lavish light, the elegant silhouettes in motion. She saw Frank, her kind neighbor, standing alone in the dark, apart from the party in his own yard. Her brow creased. Something wasn't right. Frank had no idea he was being seen. He only knew this kingdom built on image and reputation was fragile. It leaned on the crowd's consent, unpracticed smiles, and calibrated toasts. And he, a carpenter, understood what happened to anything raised on a weak foundation. Justice doesn't have to shout. Sometimes it needs only proof, timing, and a hand on the breaker. He thought about the envelope, the ring camera, the gratitude board saved to his phone. There was no hurry. This game required patience. And when the party ended and the guests were gone, when only the truth remained, he would be the one to choose when the curtain came up. The house was quiet, now a deceptive kind of quiet. The lavender scent, Helen's scent, still lingered faintly in the air, but it was fading, like a memory struggling to stay tethered to the present. Frank sat in the living room where the late afternoon light slanted through the window and caught the floating dust motes. He had lit a candle beside their wedding photo, a black and white print turned silver gray with age. In the picture, they were young, eyes shining with the promise of the future they would build together in this very house. The funeral had ended that morning. The condolences were said, the cars had driven away. Only Frank and his son, Mark, remained. And a stranger. He heard voices from the kitchen, not soft words of comfort, but sharp, transactional murmurs. He rose, his joints creaking like old floorboards, and followed the sound. The scene stopped him cold. Mark leaned against the counter. Across from him stood a man in an overly shiny suit, hands manicured, movements precise. Between them, on the granite countertop, sat Helen's blue velvet jewelry box open. Inside lay the pieces Frank had spent 40 years collecting for her. The pearl necklace for their 10th anniversary, the diamond earrings when Mark graduated, the dragonfly brooch she adored. The stranger held the necklace up, inspecting it through a jeweler's loupe. Estate pieces move fast, he said, voice smooth. Practice the tone of someone who profits from grief. Cash payment, same day. A wave of nausea rose in Frank's chest. He looked at Mark, searching his face for hesitation, for shame, anything, nothing. His son's expression was blank, businesslike. No point keeping it in a drawer, Mark said not to the buyer, but to himself. Better to turn it into cash. Then he looked at Frank and added, Mom would have wanted that. Wasn't go. Mom would have wanted that. The words hung in the air like blasphemy. Helen, who had worn those pieces not for status but for sentiment, who had guarded them not for their price but for their story. Frank felt his grief transform sharpen into something else. Cold fury. Razor clarity. He said nothing. His eyes flicked toward the kitchen corner, where the tiny blue light of the ring camera blinked steadily, recording everything. Frank turned and walked to his study, the one room where the scent of wood, oil, and varnish had always overtaken Helen's lavender. This was his domain. He didn't shout, he didn't argue. He opened the filing cabinet. His fingers traced the neatly labeled folders, home insurance, taxes, vehicle titles, until he reached one marked personal assets. Inside, in clear plastic sleeves, was everything he needed. Photos of each piece Helen owned, taken years ago for insurance purposes. Beside every photo, professional appraisals, gem certificates, serial numbers, all carefully logged. Frank was a carpenter. He believed in precision. Measure twice, cut once. Keep records. These were not abandoned trinkets. They were marital assets documented, insured, and legally part of the estate. Not items his son could hawk like yard sale leftovers. When Frank returned to the living room, the deal was wrapping up. The buyer counted a stack of cash while Mark walked him to the door. When Mark came back, he avoided his father's eyes. I know what you're thinking, Mark said quickly, but we have to be realistic. Frank said nothing, the folder heavy in his hands. Mark sighed, impatience creeping in. Anyway, he added, switching to that efficient tone he used in business calls, you should think about moving out. The place could use a refresh. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the spare key card, Frank's spare key card. I'll hang on to this. We should probably change the lock soon, for safety. That was when Frank understood. This wasn't about money. This was an erasure. Of Helen. Of memory. And now, of him. The grief didn't leave him. but it hardened into resolve. His purpose was clear: to protect Helen's legacy, her dignity, and the home they built together. He looked at Mark, the man who had once been his little boy, and saw only a stranger. Frank tightened his grip on the folder. The proof was in his hands. The electronic witness had already recorded, and the right to remove an intruder or to call those who could was still his. He opened his mouth, not to argue, but because he already knew exactly who he needed to call. The silence in the kitchen turned heavy, suffocating. Mark had set his mother's empty velvet box on the table, a mute witness to what had just happened. The dealer stood beside him, tapping his fingers on the counter, his impatience almost visible. The cash had changed hands. He just wanted to be gone. Mark faced Frank. What little patience he'd had now drained away. His expression wasn't that of a grieving son anymore. It was a CEO handling an inconvenient problem. I already called the locksmith. He'll be here within the hour, he said evenly. I'll wait. After that, you just go, Dad. Just get out. Those words, spoken under the warm light of a kitchen Helen had loved, weren't a shout. They were worse. A cold ultimatum. An eviction enforced not by force, but by pure contempt. Frank looked at his son, then at the oak wall clock he'd made 30 years ago. Its pendulum kept swinging, tick-tock, tick-tock, steady as ever in a world that had just flipped upside down. He felt no flare of anger now, only a frightening calm. He had reached a line, and he knew exactly what to do. He smiled, a small, distant smile. Then, quietly, he made a call. He didn't use the cell phone in his pocket. He walked to the old landline in the corner, the family phone. The act carried its own kind of ceremony. Mark frowned, perhaps thinking he was calling a relative to complain. Frank didn't go back to his study. He already had everything he needed in his head. He spent hours in that room putting the family papers in order. He knew where everything lived. He pulled the iPad from the kitchen drawer. Helen used to keep recipes on it. A few quick taps. He opened the Ring app. The clip from 15 minutes earlier played in clean detail. The dealer crossing the threshold. An uninvited stranger. The blue box opening. The man lifting the jewelry. Frank saved the video to the device. The witness was ready. Then he lifted the receiver. His work-roughened fingers dialed with certainty. Not 911, the town's non-emergency police line. He knew the number by heart. Hello, he said, his voice low and steady, the exact opposite of the chaos in the room. I'd like to report an ongoing theft at a private residence, along with unlawful entry. He recited his address, the one he'd called home for 40 years. Across the kitchen, Mark and the dealer fell silent. They were listening. Yes, that's right. They're still in my house, Frank continued, eyes never leaving his son's. An uninvited individual is attempting to leave with documented marital property. These items are listed on my homeowner's policy. File number 7B415. I have full appraisals and serial numbers. Each word he spoke was a brick, building a solid wall of law. And there is also a verbal elder abuse component, he added, as my son is attempting to force me out of my own home unlawfully. Frank set the receiver down. The old clock seemed louder in the sudden stillness. What the hell are you doing? Mark hissed, his face blanching with anger and shock. Frank met his eyes. The faint smile remained. I'm going to let the facts speak for themselves. And then they waited. 1 minute crawled by. The dealer began to fidget, glancing at the door. 2 minutes. Mark paced the kitchen, scrubbing a hand through his hair. You can't do this. 5 minutes. The clock's tick was the only sound. Frank stood by the phone, preternaturally calm. He trusted the process, the system. His silence, his restraint was his greatest strength now. Across the street, behind the curtain, Mrs. Gable caught a faint sound, a distant siren. She narrowed her eyes, trying to place it. 8 minutes. The siren grew louder, no longer far away, coming closer. 10 minutes. The wail hit the curb out front. The cozy kitchen burst with stuttering bands of red and blue that swept the walls, the empty velvet box, and the stunned faces of Mark and the dealer. The lights danced across Frank's composed features. The first domino had fallen. The siren cut off abruptly in front of the house, but the red and blue lights kept flashing, wild and relentless. They swept across the lawn, spilled over the white siding, and poured through the kitchen windows. The cold, official glow slid over Frank's old clock, turning every tick-tock into a pulse of judgment. Across the street, behind her lace curtains, Mrs. Gable stood motionless. She had seen everything. A sharp knock, authoritative, final. Not a neighbor's knock, not a delivery man's. Authority itself. Frank opened the door. 2 officers stood there. An older man, weariness carved into his face, and a younger woman with alert eyes. "Good evening, sir," the older one said. "We received a report of an incident here." Frank simply stepped aside. They entered, and the weight of their uniforms changed the gravity of the room. The young officer's gaze flicked from Mark to the dealer, then to the open velvet box and the cash on the counter. "Sir," she asked the dealer, "do these items belong to you?" She gestured toward the jewelry, now sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Before the man could speak, Mark cutting, his voice cracking between panic and fury. "They were my mother's. They are part of my inheritance." The older officer turned toward him, face unreadable. "Sir, you're conducting a sale inside the property you do not legally own." A procedural statement, but it struck directly at Mark's pride. His fragile control shattered. "He's delusional," Mark shouted, pointing at Frank. "This is my house now." A desperate lie. A final blow at his father's sanity. The dealer, realizing the tide had turned, raised both hands. "He told me it was his house," he stammered. "Said he had full authority." Frank said nothing. He simply placed his folder on the counter beside the cash. Opened it. Inside were crisp photos, appraisal sheets, serial numbers, all neatly documented. He flipped to a page showing the property deed. His and Helen's names were printed clearly. The young officer studied the papers, then looked up. "Mr. Miller, would you like to file a report?" Mark laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. A report? Against his own son? He wouldn't dare. Frank finally spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of 40 years. "I just want my wife's belongings returned," he said. Then, glancing toward the ring camera, "The entire incident is on record." Soften. That was the breaking point. The older officer nodded once to his partner. The younger stepped toward Mark. "Sir, please place your hands behind your back." "What? You can't do this," Mark yelled, stumbling backward. But resistance was pointless. The metallic click of the cuffs cut through the silence sharp. Final. The ring camera caught every second of it. The silent witness. And across the street, Mrs. Gable, the social witness, saw it all through the narrow slit of her curtain. The dealer was told to stay for questioning, suddenly eager to comply. The jewelry and cash were sealed in clear evidence bags. The rustle of plastic was brutally loud in the quiet kitchen. As they packed Helen's things, Frank spoke just once, barely above a whisper. "Please handle her jewelry with care." They let Mark out, across the same lawn where he had once chased fireflies as a boy. The patrol car pulled away, its lights fading down the street until only darkness remained. Frank stood alone in the kitchen. He had won. But there was no triumph, only a hollow ache. This wasn't the end. He knew it. Mark's accusation delusional wasn't a moment of rage. It was a seed planted with intent. A dangerous lie that would grow roots. The battle for Helen's jewelry was over tonight. But the battle for her honor, for the truth, and for the soul of this house had only just begun. Over 99% of viewers just sat through this story without clicking like or subscribe. Actually, it's easy, just one tap. What time is it in your area, and where are you listening? 2 days later, the silence in the house had changed. It was no longer the heavy quiet of morning, but the taut stillness of a ceasefire. Frank was wiping down tools in his woodshop, the familiar scent of linseed oil wrapping around him, when the kitchen landline rang shrill, tearing through the calm. He learned to be wary of surprise calls. A woman's voice, polite and professional in a way that grated, introduced herself from First National Bank. "Mr. Miller, I'm calling to confirm a request we just received," she said, papers rustling on her end. "We've been asked by your son, Mark Miller, to add his name as a co-owner on all of your accounts." Frank tightened his grip on the receiver. "For what reason?" More rustling. "Yes, well, according to the documentation provided, the request is due to your cognitive decline." The words came out like a question, a courteous formality wrapped around a brutal blow. Cognitive decline. Mark's delusional jab on that night hadn't been heat of the moment cruelty. It had been the opening shot. Decline? Frank repeated, his voice surprisingly even. A cold shock ran his spine, but it didn't paralyze him. It sharpened him. Yes, sir, the voice continued. He submitted a notarized statement from Dr. Levin attesting to your condition. Dr. Levin, the family doctor who treated them for 30 years, the gentleman who held Helen's hand at the end. Frank could hardly believe it. Let me be clear, Frank said, his tone turning to steel. Has the bank approved this? Oh, no, sir, she said quickly. This is a courtesy call. Under our policy for sensitive matters, we hold the request for 48 hours so you can respond. We've also emailed you with copies of the paperwork. Thank you, Frank said, and hung up. 48 hours. A clock had just started. He went straight to the old computer in his study. In his inbox sat the bank's email. He opened it. Attached was a PDF, Form 88C, Capacity Certification. He clicked. The screen filled with medical and legal jargon. At the bottom, Dr. Levin's signature. It looked right, but there was a tremor to it, something off. Beside it, a notary seal from a name he didn't recognize. The silence at Ashley's wedding had taught him a hard lesson. When betrayed, don't react, observe. And now he observed. He picked up his cell and dialed Dr. Levin's office. A young voice answered, not Marge, the nurse he'd known for years. Dr. Levin's office. How can I help you? Hello, may I speak with Dr. Levin? Frank asked. I'm so sorry, sir, the young woman said. Dr. Levin retired last month. Dr. Chen has taken over the practice. Last month? Frank's heart landed hard in his chest. There it was. The missing piece. Are you certain? He asked, thumb already sliding to tap the call recorder. Absolutely. His last day was the 15th of last month. Would you like to schedule with Dr. Chen? No, thank you. You've been very helpful, Frank said, calm as ever. He ended the call and saved the recording. Now he had it. A federal crime falsified medical records. Bank fraud. Mark had stepped out of mere greed into something darker. Frank sat a long moment, staring at the PDF. The delusional claim hadn't been a tantrum. It was part of a larger plan, one that might have been mapped out for some time. He was no longer simply a grieving father. He was the target of a calculated financial attack. He scrolled to the bottom of Form 88C again, reading line by line. And then he saw it in small print beneath the notarization. Authorized witness list provided by applicant. Only one name was listed, Ashley Vance, his daughter's name. Frank did not allow himself to feel anything. Not yet. This wasn't the moment. He printed the PDF and clipped it into the same folder that held the jewelry appraisals. He transferred the recorded call to a USB drive. He retrieved the case number the officer had given him 2 nights earlier. Then he stood, put on his jacket, and headed for the police station. He didn't hurry. He moved with the steadiness of a carpenter measuring out a perfect cut. His silence was over. It was time to let the evidence speak. Dusk had settled when Ashley arrived. The house already half claimed by shadow. Frank sat in the living room without lights. The silence had changed again, no longer tense, just quietly exhausted. Through the window, he saw her car parked by the curb. She stayed inside for a long time before finally getting out. When she rang the bell, he wasn't surprised. He'd known she would come. He opened the door. Ashley stood there looking small, fragile beneath the porch light. Gone were the polished clothes and glossy smile from her wedding day. Jeans, a sweater. The glamour had drained away, leaving only fatigue. Dad, she said, voice trembling. I heard about what happened. Can we talk privately? Frank stepped back. There's only me here, Ashley, he said. It's always private. They sat across from each other in the dim living room. Ashley twisted her fingers together, eyes darting anywhere but his. Mark called me, she began. He's out on bail. He told me everything. She took a shaky breath. About the bank papers. Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Frank said nothing. He had learned that silence could be a force. It made others feel the void. And Ashley did. Her words spilled out, clumsy and contradictory. Mark said it was just a formality. He said, since Mom's gone, The bank needed someone in the family to co-sign so you wouldn't have to deal with the paperwork yourself. He said you were grieving and shouldn't be bothered with details. Frank reached for his phone on the coffee table. With one subtle motion, his thumb slid over the screen, starting the recorder. He set the phone back down, screen face down. A natural gesture. He only gave me the last page to sign, Ashley went on, her voice cracking. I signed as a witness. I trusted him. I didn't read the rest. She truly believed that signing something unread was a defense. Frank looked at her, and for the first time in days, felt something besides pain and anger, something colder and sadder. Pity. She lived in the world of appearances and polite lies, where fine print didn't matter as long as everyone smiled. It's just temporary, Dad, she insisted, finally meeting his eyes, tears brimming. Just paperwork. Mark said, once everything's liquidated, things will go back to normal. Liquidated. The word hung between them like a crack in glass. Not resolved, not settled, liquidated. A slip, but a revealing one. She'd been promised something. She might not have known the full plan, but she knew the destination. She wasn't the architect, just a willing accomplice. Frank betrayed no emotion. Thank you for telling me, Ashley. The conversation ended soon after. Ashley, relieved by her confession, hurried out, believing she had made amends. When the door closed behind her, Frank stopped the recording. He attached the audio file and a copy of Form 88C to an email addressed to Elias Thorne. Elias wasn't just a lawyer. He was an old friend, a fellow carpenter who turned to law after an accident years ago. He understood that precision mattered, whether in cutting dovetails or building a case. He ran a small firm that represented tradesmen in disputes. Elias understood Frank's world. Less than 10 minutes later, Frank's phone rang. Frank, it's Elias. The voice came straight to the point. I listened to the recording. You sitting down? I'm sitting. Good, because you may have just documented a conspiracy to defraud by both your kids. Frank said nothing. Listen, Elias continued, sharp and measured. That girl's statement, intentional or not, ties her directly to Mark's forgery. The phrase, once everything's liquidated, shows knowledge of his intent to seize assets. This isn't just greed from one son anymore. It's coordinated. Frank felt something icy move through him. Sometimes betrayal didn't come from malice. It came from weakness, trust, and a touch of greed. The result was the same. And one more thing, Elias added, his tone darkening. That notary seal on the 88C form? I had it checked. The notary is real. But he works for a financial consultancy, a firm your son owes a substantial amount of money to. Conspiracies, Frank, usually have more than two people. You understand what I'm saying? Frank understood. The cracks in his family's foundation ran deeper than he'd imagined. And somewhere out there, someone else was helping his children bring the house down. Frank met Elias at the Daily Grind, a small cafe with scarred wooden tables and the warm smell of fresh roast. He and Helen had come here most Saturday mornings. Sitting alone at their usual table, Frank felt her presence more strongly than ever. He wasn't fighting only for himself. He was fighting for her memory. Elias arrived and set a thick file down. He didn't order coffee. He just sat, face grave. I had my people dig, he said, voice low and decisive. It's worse than we thought. He says, he slid a sheet across the table. The notary information from Form 88C, alongside a screenshot of a LinkedIn profile, Julian Croft, Senior Financial Advisor at Croft Legacy Partners. Julian Croft, Elias said, isn't just a notary. He brokers what his industry politely calls senior assets. He finds older folks with wealth and impatient heirs, pushes fast cash sales at below market prices. Then he and his investors refresh the assets and flip them for profit. Not the dard. Frank stared at Croft's confident, predatory smile in the photo, a young man with perfect hair and a hunter's grin. And here's the kicker, Elias said, turning a page, a high school yearbook photo, a young Mark Miller with his arm around an even younger Julian Croft. They were classmates, and Croft is the insurance broker Mark called to handle things after Helen died. Cold light cut through the fog, the pieces locked together perfectly and sickeningly well. The broker who should have guided a grieving family had been the architect, exploiting their loss for a predatory plan. Mark hadn't acted alone. He'd been coached and armed by a specialist in stripping the elderly. He staged the whole thing, Elias went on, anger carefully leashed. I traced emails between them. Your son signed a draft power of attorney handing Croft decision-making authority over your assets the moment the 88C cleared at the bank. This is organized fraud, Frank. R of and not. Frank leaned back. His anger was no longer hot. It had distilled into something cleaner, colder. Resolve. They think I'm the fool in the room, he said softly, almost to himself. Elias nodded. Then let them prove it in daylight. For the next 2 days, Frank's study became a command center. He and Elias worked without stopping. Frank, thinking like a carpenter, laid out the evidence with meticulous care. He built a detailed timeline. The Ring camera catching him sealing the wedding envelope, the photo of the gratitude board without his name, the kitchen clip of Mark and the dealer, the recorded call with the clinic, and finally, Ashley's naive, devastating confession. Each moment, no matter how small, was another nail in the coffin of his children's lie. They didn't stop there. Elias contacted the financial crimes unit. With Frank's irrefutable evidence, phony paperwork, recorded collusion, the FBI's elder abuse unit took interest. Frank didn't ask to have anyone hauled off. That wasn't his way. Instead, he and Elias filed a civil complaint seeking a temporary restraining order over all his assets, and they delivered the full dossier to the district attorney's office and the FBI. He didn't need vengeance or shouting. He would use the very system they tried to bend against them. Justice, like woodcraft, demanded precision, not force. A week later, a process service car pulled up in front of the upscale rental where Ashley and Kevin were living. The uniformed server handed Ashley a thick packet. Not long after, another packet landed at Mark's apartment. The next morning, a small item ran at the bottom corner of the local paper. Financial fraud investigation targeting elder exploitation underway. No names, but to those involved, it sounded like thunder. The last domino had been set in motion. Frank didn't know exactly where it would fall, but he knew this much. He was no longer the help in his own story. He was the carpenter who had built the stage, and now he would be the one to decide when the curtain comes down. Over 99% of viewers just sat through this story without clicking like or subscribe. Actually, it's easy, just one tap. What time is it in your area, and where are you listening? The district courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. Cold fluorescent light bounced off the stiff wooden benches. Frank sat upright, hands resting on his knees. His gaze fixed not on his children but on the American flag hanging solemnly behind the judge's bench. In the front row, a few of his old carpenter friends had come. They didn't speak, just nodded when he entered. Their quiet presence said more than any words could. At the back, a reporter from the local paper was scribbling notes, and Mrs. Gable sat in the last row, the silent witness who had seen it all. The hearing unfolded with startling order. Elias presented the evidence clearly, without theatrics. The Ring camera footage filled the projection screen. Frank sealing the wedding gift box, Mark and the jeweler in the kitchen, and finally the cold snap of handcuffs around Mark's wrist. Then came Ashley's trembling confession, her voice echoing through the solemn space, admitting she had signed just paperwork. When the forged medical certification appeared on screen, Julian Croft sat frozen, his face drained of color. The empire of charm and deceit he'd built was collapsing in full view. Finally, the judge, a woman with gray hair and unreadable eyes, turned to Mark. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Mark stood, his expensive suit looking out of place now. The confidence was gone, replaced by raw anger. "He's destroying my life," he shouted, pointing at Frank. "All over a bit of money." The judge didn't flinch. "Mr. Miller," she said evenly, "this is not about money. It's about integrity. You signed documents to steal what wasn't yours. You tried to strip your father of his autonomy and his dignity." She turned to Ashley, who was silently crying. "And Miss Van's naivete is not a legal defense. Also wait." Frank looked at his children, and for the first time, he felt no rage, no hurt, only a quiet sorrow. They weren't villains, not really. Just lost souls who had traded something real for something glittering and hollow. The verdict came down. License suspended indefinitely, pending criminal charges. Probation, 200 hours of community service, and a mandatory financial ethics course. Ashley fined for her complicity. Justice didn't shout. It moved with calm precision, and it did not bend. When the hearing ended, Frank stood. His carpenter friends came forward to shake his hand, firm grips, filled with respect. Outside, the crisp air met him like an embrace. Across the street, Mrs. Gable waited. She smiled warmly. Good to see you back, Frank. And for the first time in a long while, he truly was back. He drove home. The house greeted him with its familiar stillness, but now it wasn't the silence of grief or tension. It was peace. He stepped into the kitchen, glanced at the Ring camera in the corner, his silent companion. Opening the app, he turned off motion alerts. He didn't need to guard this house anymore. He didn't feel triumphant, only free. He had weathered the storm and found calm on the other side. Once called the help in his own home, once labeled senile by his own son, Frank now stood tall not as a victor, but as a survivor who had reclaimed what mattered most. Dignity was the last true possession. He went out to the workshop and flipped on the light. The smell of oak and linseed oil wrapped around him. His hands brushed the smooth grain of a half-finished board. These were the same hands that had built this house, strung the wedding lights, and patiently gathered each piece of evidence. The hands that had built the home had now rebuilt its piece. He felt no bitterness, only restored pride. 6 months later, the Ring camera captured another visitor at his door.